I was just making coffee that morning, moving slow, half awake, the kind of lazy pace you have when there's no rush to get anywhere. The kitchen was quiet except for the faint gurgle of the coffee maker, and outside, the world still felt heavy with that early morning stillness. I could smell the bitter, comforting scent filling the air, and I remember thinking about nothing in particular, just drifting. My mug was already on the counter, waiting, when I wandered into the living room to check the weather before I started the day. The TV was on low volume, some local news segment, running about road closures and weekend events. I wasn't even looking directly at it at first, just passing by, but then the screen suddenly shifted. A loud, urgent tone chimed, and a bright red bar with bold white letters appeared across the bottom. Breaking news. My hand stopped halfway to the coffee pot. The words on the screen read, "Police identify suspect in series of brutal murders." I don't know why I froze. Maybe it was the word brutal. Maybe it was just the weight of the way the anchor's voice changed. Lower, more serious. I slowly sank onto the edge of the couch, my mug still empty, and watched as the camera cut to a still image. The moment it came into focus, my stomach turned to stone. It was my brother's face. For a split second, my mind refused to process it. It was like looking at a stranger who just happened to have his exact same features, same sharp jawline, same slight shadow of stubble, same dark brown eyes. At first I actually laughed, though it wasn't a normal laugh. It was the nervous, confused kind that bursts out when you don't know what else to do. My first thought was that this was some kind of bizarre mistake or maybe a prank someone had pulled on the station. But the longer I stared, the more the laughter dried up. My skin began to prickle, and the room suddenly felt colder. My hands were shaking, though I didn't notice until a drop of water slid down the side of the empty mug I was holding. The anchor began speaking again, her voice steady, but weighted with the kind of horror that seeps into every syllable. She said his name out loud, my brother's full name, while a graphic slid onto the screen, showing a timeline of the killings. 12 murders spread across the state over the past 3 years. Dates, locations, brief notes about the victims. I realized with a sick feeling in my gut that I knew many of those places. He had been there, not just in passing, he'd told me about them. We'd talked about his trips, laughed about his bad hotel experiences, even looked at pictures he'd taken. Those memories now twisted into something rotten in my mind. My phone buzzed on the coffee table once, twice, then over and over. I glanced at the screen. Names I knew, friends, neighbors, even my mother were lighting up in rapid succession. I didn't answer any of them. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. And I didn't want to hear the questions I couldn't answer. Instead, I picked up the remote and rewound the segment. I needed to see it again to make sense of it. The still image of his mugshot filled the screen once more. It was definitely him, but it wasn't him. Not the way I remembered. His expression was flat, almost empty, and there was something about his eyes. They didn't look alive. They were cold, hard, like polished stone. No light, no warmth. It was the same gaze I'd seen sometimes when we were kids, in those rare moments when he got truly angry. But this was different. This was permanent. The anchor continued, talking about how the police had linked him to the murders through DNA evidence, surveillance footage, and witness accounts. They showed blurry images from convenience store cameras, street security feeds, frames of him walking alone at night, or leaning into his car, or glancing toward the camera with that same dead stare. I watched every second, my mind trying to reconcile the man on the screen with the one who used to sneak extra dessert for me when our parents weren't looking. The more I watched, the heavier the air in the room felt. My coffee sat forgotten, cooling on the counter. I replayed the clip a third time, zooming in on his eyes and the mugshot as if maybe I'd spot something. a hint of the brother I knew, a crack in the mask. But there was nothing. Just that lifeless stare, like he was already somewhere far away, thinking about things I couldn't begin to imagine. I thought about the last time I'd seen him. It had been a few months ago, when he stopped by unannounced late at night. He didn't stay long, just asked to borrow some money, said he was in a rush, and left without even finishing the coffee I'd made him. I remembered the way he kept glancing at the window, as if checking for someone outside. I'd brushed it off as paranoia, maybe stress from whatever trouble he was in. Now those little details came flooding back with a whole new meaning, each one heavier than the last. The TV moved on to other segments, but I barely noticed. My phone was still buzzing. But the sound felt distant, like it was coming from another room. My thoughts were spiraling. Did I miss something? Was there some sign years ago that I just ignored? I tried to piece together every conversation we'd ever had, every strange habit, every unexplained absence. They all started to fit together in ways I didn't want them to. Outside, the morning light had shifted, but inside it felt darker. The walls seemed to close in a little more with each breath. I turned the TV off eventually, but the silence that followed was worse. The image of his face was burned into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't replace it with the version of him I wanted to remember. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, listening to the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Somewhere deep down, a thought I didn't want to face began to grow. If this was true, if my brother really was the man behind those murders, then I wasn't just watching a stranger on the news. I was watching someone I had shared a childhood with, someone whose voice I could still hear in my head, someone whose number was still saved in my phone. And if all of that was real, then maybe, just maybe, there were parts of him I had never truly known at all. The coffee went cold. The phone stopped ringing, but the weight in my chest only grew heavier. I knew that nothing about my life or about him would ever be the same again. That night the air felt heavier than usual, thick and almost hard to breathe, like something unseen was pressing against the walls of my house. I kept every light on, telling myself it was just to keep the shadows away. But deep down I knew it was because I couldn't stand the idea of any corner being too dark to see. I hadn't spoken to anyone all day, ignoring calls and texts, letting them pile up into a mountain of unanswered notifications. The silence between each buzz was almost worse than the sound itself. Every so often I would glance at my front door, checking the lock, even though I knew I had already turned it 3 times. I told myself I wasn't expecting him to show up. I told myself that if he was dangerous, he wouldn't come here. But the thought wouldn't go away, that maybe I was the only person left he trusted, or worse, the only person left he wanted something from. Around midnight I heard it, 3 slow knocks. Not loud, not rushed, just deliberate. My heart skipped in a way that made my stomach twist, and for a moment I thought I might be imagining it. I sat frozen, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting to hear it again. Ere the seconds stretched out until it felt like the whole house was holding its breath. And then there it was, the sound again. 3 knocks, exactly the same. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but my hand wouldn't move. Instead, I found myself standing, my feet carrying me toward the sound, as if they weren't mine anymore. The hallway to the front door felt longer than I remembered, each step making the knots in my chest pull tighter. I didn't want to look through the peephole, but I did, and what I saw made my breath catch. It wasn't his face I saw, not clearly. It was just the shape of someone tall standing perfectly still, a dark silhouette against the dim porch light. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me. I didn't make a sound, didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. That's when I heard it, a voice low and calm, seeping through the door like a cold draft. "You believe them, don't you?" It was him. I hadn't heard his voice since that night months ago. And now here it was, just inches away from me. My mouth went dry instantly. I didn't answer. My body wanted to run, but my feet stayed rooted in place. He knocked again, harder this time, the sound echoing through the narrow hallway. "Let me in. I just want to talk." There was no anger in his tone, but that almost made it worse. It was too calm, too steady, like he knew something I didn't. I stepped back from the door, slowly, my eyes still locked on the shadow. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Then came the sound of scratching, soft at first, then sharper, like fingernails dragging down the wood. It went on, making the hairs on my arms stand up. My breathing was so loud now it felt like it filled the whole house. And then, through the scratching, I heard him say something else. Just 2 words, but they cut through me like ice. They only found 12. I felt my legs weaken. I didn't understand if it was a threat, a confession, or some twisted attempt to get me to open the door. I stumbled back until I hit the wall, my eyes darting to the nearest window. For a second I thought about running out the back, but the thought of turning my back on that door was worse. I stood there in the hallway for what felt like hours, the scratching eventually stopping, the silence slowly wrapping itself around the house again. I didn't dare look through the peephole a second time. Eventually I moved to the living room, keeping my eyes on the hallway, like if I blinked, the door would suddenly swing open. I sat there with the light still blazing, my phone in my lap, my hands hovering over the screen, but never pressing the call button. I thought about calling the police, but then the image of his face on the news came back to me, and the idea of telling them he had been here felt dangerous. If they came for him and he somehow escaped again, he would know it was me who told, and then there would be no one left between me and him. The minutes dragged on, the digital clock on the wall ticking past 1, then 2, then 3. Every creak of the house made me flinch. I kept expecting to hear the knocks again, but they never came. When the sky outside began to lighten, I dared to believe maybe he was gone. The relief didn't feel like relief, though it felt like a pause, like the silence before a storm. I finally stood and walked toward the door, my legs stiff from sitting so long. Through the small window beside the frame, I could see nothing on the porch, no sign of him. But when I opened the door just a crack, my breath caught. There were muddy footprints on the steps, large and heavy, leading away from the porch. They didn't go toward the street. They went around the side of the house, disappearing into the shadows of the backyard. I closed the door slowly, making sure to turn the lock 3 more times. I didn't go outside to follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. The rest of that day passed in a haze. I kept replaying his words in my head, trying to decide what they meant. They only found 12. Was it a warning? A confession that there were more victims than the police knew about? Or was he trying to scare me, to let me know he was still in control of the story? No matter how I turned it over in my mind, it didn't change the fact that he had been at my door, that he knew where I lived, that he could come back whenever he wanted. By nightfall I was exhausted, but I didn't sleep. I stayed in the living room, lights on, eyes darting between the door and the window. Every noise outside, cars passing, branches scraping against the siding, made my pulse jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't gone, that he was somewhere close, maybe watching, maybe waiting. I kept thinking about the way he used to be when we were kids, how he could hide for hours during hide and seek, not making a sound, waiting for the exact moment to scare me. Back then, it was a game. Now it felt like the same game, only this time, I didn't know what would happen if he won. When the clock crept past midnight again, I knew sleep wasn't coming. I sat there in the dim hum of the lights, staring at the door, and realized something I didn't want to admit. It wasn't just fear keeping me awake. It was the knowledge that part of me still wanted to open the door, still wanted to look him in the eye and ask him why. By the time the sun began to rise the next morning, my eyes burned from staying open all night. I hadn't moved much from the couch, still wrapped in the same blanket I had pulled around myself hours ago, but my body felt like I'd run a marathon. Every muscle was tight, my head heavy, and yet my nerves were still sharp, waiting for something to happen. The quiet outside felt unnatural, as if the world was holding its breath. When I finally worked up the courage to open the front door, I told myself it was only to prove that everything was fine, that the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But the moment I stepped outside, my chest tightened again. The footprints were still there, dried mud now crusted along the steps, leading toward the backyard. I didn't follow them, but I couldn't stop staring, wondering how long he had stood out here, how close he had been while I sat just feet away on the other side of the wall. I went back inside quickly, locking the door behind me, trying to shake the feeling that eyes were still on me. I had barely sat down when there was a knock at the door. Not 3 slow knocks like before, but sharp and quick. My stomach dropped, but when I peeked through the side window, I saw it wasn't him. 2 uniformed police officers were standing there, their expressions unreadable. I opened the door just enough to hear them. One of them asked if I had seen my brother. I didn't answer right away. My mouth felt dry, my mind running in circles. Finally, I told them no, that I hadn't seen him in months. They exchanged a look that made my skin crawl. And then one of them explained that my brother had escaped custody the night before. I didn't tell them he had been here. I couldn't bring myself to. Then they told me something else, something that made my hands go cold. 2 officers had been killed during his escape, and he hadn't been alone for the last sighting. Someone had seen him in the early hours of the morning, carrying something heavy into the woods behind my house. The neighbor had described the second person as smaller, wearing a dark hoodie, face not clearly visible. My heart started pounding so hard, I thought they could see it through my chest. I wanted to scream that it wasn't me, that I had been inside all night. But then I remembered something that made my stomach twist into knots. My hands. When I looked down at them, I saw the faint lines of dirt under my fingernails, and when I rubbed my thumb against my palm, I saw something darker there, something red. I didn't remember going outside. I didn't remember touching anything in the woods, but the sight of that dirt, that color, made my mind spin. The officers were still talking, asking me if I would call them immediately if he contacted me. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. They left a card with a phone number and walked back to their car, leaving me standing in the doorway with my heart racing and my thoughts unraveling. I closed the door slowly, every creak in the hinges sounding louder than it should. My eyes drifted to the back window, toward the line of trees beyond the yard. It felt like they were pulling at me, drawing me closer. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop. I kept imagining him out there, watching, waiting for night to fall again. I moved to the sink and started scrubbing my hands. But no matter how hard I washed, I couldn't seem to get them clean. The smell of metal clung to my skin, faint but unmistakable. That night I couldn't bring myself to turn off the lights. I sat in the living room again, every curtain closed, every lock checked twice. I kept telling myself I wouldn't hear the knocks this time, that he had moved on, but deep down I knew better. And sure enough, sometime after midnight I heard it. Not knocking this time, tapping. Light, irregular, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the back of the house, I didn't move. The tapping stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe I had imagined it. Then came the voice, low, almost a whisper, but clear enough that I could hear every word. 13. The sound froze me to the spot. My mind flashed back to the news broadcast, to the timeline of 12 victims, and then to his words from the night before. They only found 12. My throat tightened. I wanted to yell to tell him to leave, but my voice was gone. I stood, moving slowly toward the back window. I stumbled back, knocking over the coffee table. Every instinct screamed through the house. But by the time I scrambled to the window just beyond the edge of the porch light, the yard was empty. Was the shape of someone standing perfectly I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The darkness hid his face, but I knew it was him. I just paced the house, checking the doors. He didn't, staring out the windows, waiting for another sound that never came. When morning finally came, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like a warning. The sunlight didn't make me feel safe. It just made the shadows sharper. So I kept thinking about what the police had said, about the neighbor's sighting, about the dirt and the red under my nails. And no matter how much I told myself I hadn't done anything, a part of me started to wonder if maybe I had. I still haven't called the number they left. I keep it on the counter, staring at it sometimes, knowing I should pick it up and tell them everything. But I also know that if I do, and if he finds out, there will be no one left to stop him from making me number 14. And every night since I hear it, not always knocking. Sometimes it's the sound of footsteps outside. Sometimes the faint creak of the porch, but always before it stops, I hear that same word, like it's being whispered right into my ear. 13.